Great, okay. Well, welcome back after lunch. Hope everyone's sated. And welcome to the World Museums session this afternoon, where we've got the usual format. So, great pleasure to introduce Sharon MacDonald, Professor at Manchester Social Anthropology, one of the preeminent museum scholars, both from a kind of theorising of museums point of view and also the kind of ethnography of museums as such. Sharon's most recent book is Difficult Heritage, Negotiating the Nazi Past from Nuremberg and Beyond. But she's got a long list of classics behind her, including some great collections, Theorising Museums, The Politics of Display, and Behind the Scenes at the Science Museum in particular, and a companion to museum studies. So lots of stuff we're all, I'm sure, familiar with. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, and I need this.
Oh, sorry, yes, the symbolic handing over of the...
Thank you. I'm surrounded by technological things here. Well, I do apologise actually that that we need the lights down, especially as it's just after your lunch, and it's. I'm sort of hoping you're not too sated, because then you're even more likely to fall asleep, really. And I've got. I also have a text that I'm going to read, which I hope won't send you to sleep. Though my children tell me I tell very good bedtime stories, so I'm a little worried here. I'm going to do something I've never done as well, which is I'm going to read it off the screen. So I'm hoping that I can manage to do this in a way that's going to work. Okay then. The background image to this opening slide is from the World Museum, or the World Museum in Rotterdam. It's the only museum that I know that contains a travel agency. The World Museum came into being in 2006, having previously been the city's ethnographic museum, and that in turn had been set up in 1885. The renaming as the World Museum entailed an extensive refurbishment and redisplay of the collections, as well as this installation of this independent travel agency. Now, including a travel agency in a museum has a neat logic. You've seen the things from other parts of the world on display. Now you're offered the opportunity to go on a voyage yourself, even perhaps to acquire objects of your own for your own collections and displays. Now, note that here the display cases at the agency's entrance of artefacts that might be museum artefacts, but aren't. And note too this peculiar faux taxidermic display of large toy tigers. Now the travel agency and the museum, we might say, have a relational affinity, offering up similar but nevertheless distinctive possibilities in relation to movements of objects, people, memories and identities. Putting a travel agency in a museum brings this into play, as in a slightly different constellation does a shop, extending the museum's possibilities, at least imaginatively, in the process. The travel agency prompts us to get away from the museum. The shop lets us take objects home with us. In different ways, however, they're both modes of taking the museum with us into our own lives beyond it. Now, what I wanted to do today was use this kind of insertion of a travel agency into a museum as a point of departure for a probably extremely speculative journey into thinking about this topic that I've been allocated, this World Museums. It's the only travel agency I know of, okay, and if anyone knows any others, do tell me. But I wanted to use it as the beginning of asking what seems to me, and I think we see this in the papers that have been circulated as well, so for many of you too, to be a crucial subsection, or sub-question rather, of the question that's been set for this overall debate. So namely, not just what role do museums play in the globalisation of culture, but are we seeing transformations in that role? And that's a question that I hope that by the end of these next couple of days of debates, we might have come a bit nearer to answering, maybe to nuancing a bit further. And so what I really want to do here is simply sort of put some more examples and questions and thoughts to contribute to this. So I'm doing so through this topic of world museums and the closely related discourse of world cultures. And it's quite a neat topic, I think, to try and do this with, and thank you to the organisers for allocating this to me, and I've quite enjoyed just sort of playing around with it over the last week or so. So its very terms indicate some kind of reflection on what we might call the globality of museums and of cultures. So we can look and see how this idea is being understood and deployed by museums, and in doing so perhaps get some handle on what might be involved in the proliferation of this talk since the 1990s. Now, museums have, of course, as many scholars and many contributors here have pointed out, long been tangled up with processes that we might call globalisation. And many kinds of museums might be said to have been world museums since their beginnings. It's a point that was made strongly by Neil MacGregor, director of the British Museum, in his lecture earlier this year, which was entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be a World Museum?" And that was a lecture that was given to mark this 250th anniversary of the opening of the BM to the public. So built on the collections of Hans Sloane, the BM was from the outset an assembly of objects from different parts of the world. As such, it was a product of globalisation of a sort, a process which scholars these days seem to project ever further back into the past. And it was also an agency of bringing knowledge about other parts of the world to those who could manage to get to the museum. Well, Martin Prösler's now surely classic essay that some of you refer to on museums and globalisation, he argues that, and I quote, "Museums, realising the world in their modes of ordering, are actively involved in globalisation." And what he then does is he goes on to kind of pick out some of and highlight some of the different ways in which that might operate. So he reminds us first about the princely and gentlemanly cabinets of the 15th and 16th centuries that were conceived as theatra mundi, representations of the world in microcosm. He also points out that the global spread of the 19th century Western Metropolitan Museum model was part of processes of imperialism, colonialism, and nationalism. And in his more detailed study there, or in that chapter, it's fairly short, but where he turns to the National Museum of Sri Lanka, and what he shows there is how local culture becomes refracted through what he calls first world categories, so these categories of the museum. So, for example, he talks about these kolam masks. Actually, this is one from the BM, but they have them in the Sri Lanka museum. They're normally used in village performances and sort of matters to do with health and so on. But they get transformed in the museum, he writes, through categories such as folklore, art, and a particular idea about representation, rather than being seen as integral parts of life. So, in passing, he does note that even within that kind of imposition, there might be scope for different kinds of local interpretations, but it's quite clear that in the main, those are going to be kind of against the grain of the museum offer. So, his account of globalisation then, even while it draws on Robertson to stress the differentiating tendencies of globalisation, as well as the more obvious homogenising capacities, tends to see that differentiation as primarily on the West's terms. So it's like Richard Handler's rather nice description of multiculturalism as, and I quote, "like a row of ethnic restaurants in any North American city, all making use of a set of presuppositions that they share with their customers about what constitutes ethnic food, how, where, and when to eat it, how to pay for it, and what its value as nutrition and authentic experience is. This entails," he says, "a common market to produce differences that make them all the same. So a key question for our overall theme then might be whether this is the kind of role that museums inevitably play in globalisation. Well, Peruzza's essay was published in 1996, and he and Handler were certainly not alone in concluding that, if not inevitable, this kind of production of essentially the same kinds of differences was what was going on. But have things changed since then? Well, this is what I want to sort of play around with by having a look at this discourse of world museums and world cultures. In doing that, I decided I wouldn't include World Heritage directly in this mix, partly because it has this longer, with the 1972 UNESCO listings declaration history. It has been more discussed, it is better documented, and these very important questions of restitution that we keep coming up against, and that there are more papers on, and especially in the session, the next one by Susan, they'll all take us more deeply into that. But although I'm not addressing that directly, it undoubtedly has, I think, been one of the kind of motive forces for this world emphasis. Certainly that was very clearly part of what was involved in that adoption of the term Universal Museum in the declaration that Mads mentioned this morning. And the sort of implicit argument there was really, if we are in effect sites of world heritage, why should this be dispersed to narrow nationalistic interests? People from all over the globe come to us, and we safeguard this universal patrimony. So the world label, I think, also helps to do that kind of work. But I don't think that's all that's going on. And just a sort of side note, interestingly, that declaration, which used to be hosted on the BM website, isn't there anymore. And actually there's a very interesting something else, which I won't go into, but a memorandum of all sorts of agreements with all sorts of other museums. And I think I presume it may be, who knows, due to the massive criticism that there has been of that. But it seems to me as well, museums are not talking the language of universal museums very much now. They were, but this world museum is the sort of preferred term. Now, it might, of course, be the case that this is just, talk, it's just repackaging of essentially the same, even if, but even if that's the case, it's interesting, why are museums adopting this sort of language? Well, in 2005, Liverpool City Museum was reborn as World Museum Liverpool, and like most museums, this was like a sort of mini national museum conceived on this sort of universalism, so in other words a partial and rather eclectic mix of the natural and cultural, drawn from many but not all parts of the world. Now, rather charmingly, or maybe disarmingly, the museum's own website explaining its new name, it simply says, because our collections come from across the globe, the name World Museum seemed appropriate. And I have to say, I can't do this really, but if you try and hear that with a Scouse accent, it changes it a little bit. You do have this, so there's a glimmer of self-humour at bringing down this concept, I think, with such a rather banal and obvious claim. But it was ever thus, in a way, that the museum was founded on collections from across the globe. And the new museum did entail lots of reorganisation, but it didn't entail any expansion of its collections. It did, though, also use this sort of world cultures term, so representing what had been ethnography as world culture. And that, you see there, is still fairly conventional, dividing the world up into continents, and it still is kind of predicated on this European, non-European distinction, so sort of world is non-European here. But what you also see right throughout is a real emphasis on connections between different peoples of the world and objects, on trade routes and bringing people together and so on. So rather than a sort of representation of discrete peoples and cultures, is very typical of these reorganizations of graphic collections under this world label. And we see it in many of these kind of museums. So going back to Rotterdam's World Museum, that too does this sort of big continents thing, but it's also accompanied by lots and lots of thematic connections on things that can somehow make sort of connections. So this is one called Sneakers, and that's using another thing that I think is an increasingly common museological approach of a kind of object biography, so tracing things through different kinds of links to different places and peoples. It's something also in an exhibition there called Rotterdammers, where what happens there is using the city as a kind of locus for illustrating cultural diversity, and all brought together through this sort of theme of the city. And that too, I think, is an approach that it seems to me has really gathered pace since that sort of time of the Prösler article. We see it illustrated in reorganizations of city museums and numerous exhibitions and new museums concerned with immigration that have been created since then. And it's also linked, I think, to that attempt in many museums, and Caroline will discuss this later in this session, to discover and highlight diversity and other histories in existing collections. And that sort of discovery and recovery process we're finding in many sorts of museums, but I think it's ethnographic collections that very often are called especially to do this kind of cultural connection work. And I did a sort of just looking to see, when and how many, which museums have sort of set up departments of world culture or had curators of world culture, and it's really, there are many of them now, especially in Britain and especially in Germany. And I rather liked when I was sort of doing this sort of, I don't know if it counts as research, but this rummaging around, the Museum of World Cultures in Frankfurt, for example, which again it was formerly the city's ethnographic museum. It's given itself this rather nice subtitle of Ort der Annäherung, so literally a place for coming nearer. So while ethnographic exhibitions can be said to have always allowed people to maybe get closer to the material culture of others, many cultural critics have argued that the key cultural work performed by such museums was nevertheless a kind of distancing and hierarchy, a setting up of the other. Now, so that's the account we typically get for his, I suppose, until quite recently. But that surely was always a bit shaky as something going on. And in my view, we do better to see the ambivalence of these collections' potential, and as well to recognise material culture's subversive availability to be interpreted beyond curatorial intent. So, there's probably been much more going on than just that story, but of course, likewise, we'd have to say that the same. So, visitors to Rotterdam, Liverpool, and Frankfurt to these world culture exhibitions may well still see them in terms of funny people in foreign lands doing weird things. I'll just very briefly touch on another example. This isn't just for Frederick and his Swedish claims, but one of the most discussed examples, it's become a bit of a model, I think, is the Museum of World Culture in Gothenburg in Sweden that opened in 2004. And that's just the museum's homepage. And actually there's loads and loads of text about their mission and so on, but you see just within that, this role of mediating between peoples and cultures being very explicitly made. And together with this idea that this can somehow reduce conflict, and so seeing that rather explicitly as the museum role. And the kinds of exhibitions, the topics there, so we have these ones about products or objects moving across and between cultures, so the border crossing phenomenon with something like Bollywood. We also have, and I think these are two other tropes that we quite often find in these sorts of contexts, one about trying to get away from the idea that it's only the old, authentic stuff that is tradition. So these things about the Dishum exhibition is about female Hindi boxers. So it's sort of challenging stereotypes and so on. And also, and another, I think, very common theme, this one of looking at the museum and its practices, and sometimes in quite condemnatory ways. So A Stolen World is actually about Peruvian textiles and their looting and so on, and how they ended up in museums. So one feature of these changes then, and maybe sometimes it's more claimed than real, is the museum acting as a kind of cultural social worker. And I didn't know Ken Arnold had said that, actually, so there we are, he got there before me. But this role of mediating between people. And sometimes some of these exhibitions are very short on material culture. I mean, those in Rotterdam are really very short on material culture and don't draw that much on the museum collections. So there is this sort of shift from that to this sort of social role. And it's also massively represented too in all these events, bringing people into the museum, setting up all sorts of community type work, which have massively expanded really over this last decade. Now, one very simple prompt to some of this is just the fact that there might well be people living nearby whose supposed culture that the museum artefacts from, and they're just down the road. And immigration and mobility have also thrown up other conundrums over where people are in fact from and what. So, can we even talk about their cultures? Or, as Neil McGregor put it in his lecture, the relationship between there and here has been materially transformed. We can no longer talk about things as just being from one place. I don't know if we ever really, really could, but... and he concludes, the world now lives together. But what does or should this mean? Does it mean that local differences will disappear or become insignificant? Well, that seems to be the implication from this quote from another World Museum director, in this case Thomas Krenz. And I should remind you that Krenz is the, until recently, former director of the Solomon Guggenheim Foundation, so that responsible for that franchising of the Guggenheim in what's sometimes called the McGuggenheim effect. And I'll just let you have a look at it. There's some pretty weird stuff there, but we could talk about it later. But world culture seems to be, I think, from this, some sort of thing that's shared across the world. It seems to be maybe some kind of mix of predominantly Western high culture and consumer culture. And if the sorts of exhibitions that he spearheaded at the Guggenheim outpost, like Bilbao, to be taken as evidence of that, that would seem to be what he means. So with exhibitions like The Art of the Motorcycle and Giorgio Armani. His latest venture, of course, though he's now stepped down, is Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, which is currently under construction, and we have to talk about that more sometime in this, we keep mentioning it, which will sit alongside the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, also currently under construction, and a whole set of other institutions with Western links. So in this case, the way this world term is operating is a kind of cultural superlative, and that's surely the main reason why the United Arab Emirates has brought up the services and name and reputation of these institutions. And there are, I think, quite a lot of things at work here, though, and maybe that's for further discussion. But what is clear, I think, is this isn't just some straightforward cultural imperialism. This isn't like Prösler's Sri Lanka masks exhibition example. So not only are the United Arab Emirates the paymasters, they're also calling the shots in cultural terms on matters such as no nudes on display. And there have been predictions that there are going to be showdowns over this. The curators are going to want to, decide. I doubt it. We'll see. Now, I heard Neil McGregor on a radio programme, I think, rule out the idea of a British Museum Abu Dhabi, but Jonathan said something a little different yesterday, and now we know that there's an exhibition on its way, so I don't know. But in different ways, the BM has also been, and we heard a lot about this yesterday, but it has been involved in unprecedented levels of cultural diplomacy and links with museums in other parts of the world, especially at a new level really in recent years. And this sort of world discourse features prominently in this. So this travelling exhibition, Treasures of the World's Cultures, which is currently in Victoria with the British Museum Experience, but previously went to Taipei and Hong Kong. And that, I think, is a very interesting sort of counterpart to these exhibitions that Sally's going to be talking about later in this session. And there are also plans for some more exhibitions in China. And these are to follow this so-called icebreaker exhibition that they had in 2007, called Britain Meets the World, 1714 to 1830. And an interesting quote by McGregor on it. He explained, and this is his terms, that the Chinese had requested this exhibition as a model for how to build an empire. They kept asking, he says, how an old country, meaning Britain, became a world country. So luckily the World Museum was able to step in with an object lesson. It's interesting, though, that in Neil McGregor's World Museum lecture, the event that he picks out as the landmark beginning of a new direction was in 2006, when museum staff from Kenya were invited to spend time in the BM, working with the exhibitions to put on an exhibition about in Kenya. And actually the exhibition was also about links with other African countries. And what he said was, it's the first time that the museum has acted in this way, seeing itself as a lending library. And that was seen as such a big deal. I mean, in some ways it doesn't seem such a big deal really, maybe, but it seemed to be seen as such a big deal because it involved a relinquishing of control by the museum. And that idea of giving up control of listening, learning, co-working, collectively conversing, being a contact zone, and all of those things are certainly another dimension of the world developments. But how far do they really go? Does this move, and should it really, challenge the fundamentally Western museum? Might we have more chance of a challenging cultural encounter if we take up the offer of the travel agency rather than the museum? Well, those are questions that still require more studies, and it's really great to have all you people who are going to go out and do all the things we need to know about. And we also, I think, need more ideas for innovative practice, and especially theoretically informed ideas for innovative practice. But I wanted to end, just to throw as a provocation really, with an example, I think, of intriguing, but also extremely, fairly problematic, innovative ideas that are currently being put into practice. And this is ideas at the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia. And it's Tony Shelton's plans, I think they're due to be open later this year, for what he calls the multiversity galleries. And what he plans to do there is that instead of using a single exhibitory logic to display the material culture of different Native American First Peoples, each different first people nation will get to choose their own kind of exhibitionary logic. So, for example, one group might decide, what we want to do is look at, do it in terms of sort of our ideas about nature and classification of stuff in those terms. For another, and I'm sorry I can't remember the names of who does what because I just heard this as a talk, but another, it might be in terms of particular kind of ideas from ritual practice and so on. So you have these different exhibitory logics. And then that's how the stuff would be displayed. But rather than say anything further here, I'm going to leave that for your own reflection and discussion. But I just wanted to note that one of the challenges in doing this for the curators was not to let other First Nations know what each other were doing, and in particular, not to let any of them know that what the Haida, so the most powerful native people in this area, were planning to do was just to show their most beautiful objects. Otherwise, they thought they'd all want to do the same. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Okay, so we'll carry on as before and just run through the papers and then have the questions afterwards. So, Susan.
Can I turn the lights on?
Yeah, sure. Move the simple at the top. So Susan Ashley, welcome to you. And so I'm sure there's a lot more than's written down in this short paragraph here, but this is what we're told about you, is that you're a PhD candidate at York University in Toronto. And the title of your PhD project, Museum Renaissance, Revisioning the Public Interest at the Royal Ontario Museum. And a number of publications are listed here, including intriguing titles like The Changing Face of Heritage at Canada's National Historic Sites and International Journal of Heritage Studies, and Heritage Institutions, Resistance Praxis in the Canadian Journal of Communications. So,
thank you. Really hard to go after you, though. This isn't fair. I have to thank everybody very much for having me here. I am, well, not the lone North American, but the only one from a North American university. So thank you so much for inviting me. Well, as many of us have noted, globalization, characterized by worldwide exchanges of information, images, money, people, is not new to the museum world. I think we're all going to start with that line. My paper is about the relationship between museums and the peoples that museums encountered, basically, collected from over the centuries, and what efforts have been made to revise the relations between the institution and those peoples that have been characterized as others. So what I've done is I've called these efforts the 4 R's. So I think there's like about 6 R's. Recognition, restitution, representation, and reconfiguration. And I argue in the longer paper that the first 2, recognition and restitution, and to a certain extent representation, are efforts that cultural policy theorist Kevin Mulcahy calls democratization of culture, or the process by which other peoples are allowed in to play our game, so, as you were referring to. The last point, reconfiguration, implies a policy of cultural democracy, and that means actually changing the game itself and critically considering how this will happen. Global interactions and relations with others appear to have defined museums throughout history, but the nature of these relationships have lately been challenged, as we know. The global collapse of space and time has meant that museums must contend with other cultures, bumping up against them with more frequency and intensity. Bennett points out, for example, that museum audiences are increasingly made up of peoples they once considered to be part of their object. So museums have attempted to transform their relationship with these others. Attempts have been made to address recognition and restitution, that is, redressing colonial collecting and recording practices. Colonial subjects across the globe have made claims for the return, payment for, or sharing of human remains, burial objects, archaeological, ethnographic records, and so on. So, for example, in Canada, and there's many examples, the Kwakiutl are repatriating confiscated potlatch materials and rehousing them in places like Umista and the Kwakiutl Museum in Cape Munge. Repatriation goes hand in hand with restitution, as apologies are made, and with symbolic recognition, where hidden or forgotten experiences and histories are accepted into or approved by the broader community. So this means in museums, anyway, that exhibition content has been broadened or existing collections reorganized so they could be interpreted in new ways, such as Liverpool. And sometimes national narratives in museums have been readjusted. But representation, my third R, is a trickier problem. Maybe not trickier, a different problem. Postmodern sensibilities and global flows have made plain the multiple forms of otherness that are out there, and people's diverse meaning-making practices. But in museums, how to truly acknowledge power relations and admit new voices into the production and representation of knowledge is still very problematic. How is one to represent other cultures without displaying an essentialized version of it? Who gets to represent and speak for a culture or a society? Are there any universal ideas or objects free for anyone to represent? How to present conflicting or controversial stories and perspectives of cultures and of knowledge. How to represent in museums tends still to be discussed as an instrumental question of content and collaboration, and addressed through problematic policies like social inclusion. And not increasingly, but the tendency seems to be weak celebratory types of multiculturalism, or nationalistic patriotism, I guess, as Maz was talking about, and politics or difficult knowledge avoided or flattened into universal diversity, cosmopolitan type claims, removing the power in the politics entirely. The final R that I talk about, reconfiguration, implies the other policy perspective of cultural democracy, or changing the game entirely. An approach where museums actively take place in social change, democratic processes are agents, where authority actually might be in the hands of the others. In Canada, for example, Native activism has resulted in some significant collaborations and changes to structures and to practices in public museums like the Glenbow. Also importantly, activism by Native people themselves has resulted in the creation of museums specifically devoted to expressing Indigenous perspectives on culture and heritage, such as the Woodland Cultural Center. I mean, there's many of them. Critics argue that this sidesteps inclusion. But these single-voice museums can also be seen as places that assert local authority. They allow unconventional intellectual and cultural production and affirm community solidarity. And in cases like the National Museum of the American Indian, the museum becomes a significant political center for asserting and mobilizing sovereignty. So I think that these kind of group-oriented museums do represent new kinds of museum-making practices, examples of new ways of being relevant and useful that perhaps might ensure museum survival as contemporary social institutions. And because globalization means, for many people, deterritorialization, so that is migration to new locations, I'm interested in this museum making as a practice used by people as a way of making sense of their transformed world. And this, again, implies new ways of thinking about and understanding museums in relation to subjectivity, to ways of knowing, to ways of producing knowledge. And it might entail, as well, for example, enlisting bottom-up grassroots intellectuals who will bring forth new questions, new topics, new values, politics, and understandings that will contribute to museum discourse. I don't see anybody like that here. Multiple kinds of new knowledge making does not just apply to non-Westerners, but also must include new modes of thinking and knowledge creation that might emerge from other types of others, such as new media users and the way they construct knowledge. Too many little notes here. Reconfiguration might also mean returning, and I think we've discussed this a little bit, to the historical strength of museums as places for material or unmediated sensual experiences. And I mean this both in terms of objects, but also face-to-face contact with other people, which I think is crucial. It might mean considering museums as heterotopia, spaces of dispersion, that contest and reverse the normalized order of things, and which hold a range of possibilities because of their complexity and fluidity. So perhaps by emphasizing a deterritorialized, bottom-up, material, heterotopic approach to museology, museums can then be reframed as purveyors of global and transnational ways of engaging with ever-changing, emergent ways of thinking about our placement among others. And I suspect perhaps this is what they were trying to do at Croydon. Okay. But what I want to bring to this is another idea, I guess. So while I think that this is kind of the only moral way that a new museum can function in a globalized world, in actual fact on the ground, it's so hard to comprehend how to change that bureaucratic entity that is a museum. Let's say a topic of global implications is presented to a museum. How should they act as a social agent? In a sort of a policy of cultural democracy, how to proceed? What kinds of ways can we deal with this? And I offer one example, and I'd love to hear people's comments on this, of real political difficulties that can happen when you're trying to open things up to many voices and all of these other new ways of doing things. In Toronto at the Royal Ontario Museum, an exhibition has been planned to open in June on the Dead Sea Scrolls in cooperation with the Israeli Antiquities Commission. And it was thought to be an excellent possibility as a broad, inclusive kind of exhibit, could facilitate different discussions on religion from many perspectives, Christians, Jews, Muslims, so on. But last month, the Palestinian government sent a formal letter to the Canadian Prime Minister declaring the exhibit a violation of international law and called on Canada to cancel the show. So this brings us back to the idea of ownership. They argued that the scrolls were acquired illegally by Israel when the Jewish state annexed East Jerusalem in 1967. So violates at least four, I don't know which ones, international conventions, maybe you know better, on the treatment of cultural goods. So this exhibition is not just a simple social inclusion exercise where museums invite immigrants and minority groups to a feel-good session with objects. It's an example of an exhibition which is laden with complex political, social, cultural implications of keen interest to Canadians, certainly, beyond just the scholarly topic of scrolls as antiquities. Canadians of Palestinian and Israeli descent, especially students born in Canada, have latched onto this as a significant event. And in addition to, a whole range of other people in Toronto, immigrants, people who have lived there in Canada for generations, they're all interested in viewing these international icons and learning about their history and context. So surely this is an incredible, teachable moment for the museum. in many ways, a prime opportunity for the reconfigured museum. The challenges, well, I've kind of listed a list. I'm sure I'm beyond time here, for the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum in this case. And they include things that the ROM just did not seem to anticipate, and do relate, I think, back to my 4 R's. Who decides ownership of materials when others lay claim to them or want to repatriate them? Should Canada recognize the Palestinians' authority to dispute the materials? Who decides on the nature of the representation of the Dead Sea Scrolls in this case? Who decided that the Dead Sea Scrolls should be put on the stage in the first place? Like, what are the thought processes behind that as a topic? Can it ever be just a case of straightforward archaeological interpretation here? Is it ever just an academic research topic? How do curators, with their, certainly in this case, with their disciplinarian background, possibly have the expertise to navigate the kind of complex social issues that are going to be raised by this exhibition and the reactions to it? What other questions? If many voices are included, what will happen? Would that just be a cacophony of shouting that happens? The museum is anticipating demonstrations in front of their lovely new building by Daniel Libeskind. Perfect setting. How to deal with that? How should the museum deal with that? Should the exhibit itself be altered to acknowledge the political controversy? Should the controversy just be channeled into side programs and events, which is what the museum is going to do? And what about the docent tours, the volunteer tours, the interpreters, the educators? What should they do and say? Try to keep a rational, distant perspective here, or will they wade in and acknowledge the controversy, address it in some way, take a side? The list goes on. And I'm sure there's many other questions, and hopefully maybe you'll be able to discuss and help me out here. But this is a real-life current example of how museums have a role to play in global culture and in the lives of the many others that make up their audiences and their participants. Which of course cannot just be culture in the old sense, but culture as it's played out politically, socially, and economically in real-world museums. And that's it.
Thanks, Susan. 1 or 2 questions for us to sort out in the next hour. So our next speaker is Caroline Bressey, who's a lecturer in human geography at University College London. Oops. And Caroline has many advisory and curatorial roles recently, including being advisor and co-curator of the new London Sugar and Slavery exhibition at the Museum of Docklands. She's an advisor to the Higher Education and Heritage working group, the Mayor's office in London, and the Victoria Albert Museum. The list goes on. Recent edited work, New Geographies of Race and Racism, for example, from Ashgate 2008. So your talk is going to be Scratching the Surface, National Museums and Global Histories.
Thank you. I haven't got the mic.
Oh, sorry. I'm really quite neglecting my...
Thank you. Great. Okay. So yes, I come as someone who's worked in museums as an advisor, as a curator, but never full time, and mostly someone who's interested in representations of national identity through museums, particularly Black history, which I'll come on to a little bit in a moment. And so, although we've talked quite a little bit about how many of the museums, particularly in Britain or in Europe, are global museums, i.e. they represent global cultures, they've sort of become parts of European national identity, and it's a kind of interesting paradox, I think, that these sort of great spaces of national identity that is usually incredibly white and incredibly seen in a very particular kind of way, is made up of these kind of international collections. So I think, you know, that's one thing we might want to think about, that there's nothing inherently democratic or equal about, you know, the international or the global, whatever. It doesn't imply that things will be becoming increasingly democratic at all. And so, as I sort of highlighted in my paper, that none of these things were really brought to the surface during the bicentenary of the abolition of the British slave trade, which was commemorated or celebrated here in the UK, depending on how you see it, in 2007. And for various political reasons, which we can go into if people are interested, partly through a big push of funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund, which was mentioned earlier today, a number of the major museums and lots of local museums, indeed up and down the country, decided to put on exhibitions around issues around the bicentenary. One of them, and I've stolen the title of my talk, from an exhibition that was at the National Gallery and curated by a friend of mine called Jonah Albert. And his idea there was that the idea that you just have to scratch just beneath the surface of many British sort of institutions of heritage or whatever to find these kinds of international links, which are usually quite obviously denied. So the way his exhibition was set up, if you have a chance to go to the National Gallery, I'm sure many people have been before, there's a particular space where there are 4 incredibly large portraits, including this one of Mrs. rather glum Mrs. Oswald, sitting in her plantation in Jamaica, which she inherited from her husband. And the label, the standard label that goes with that, sort of talks about, you know, this is in Jamaica, she had this large estate, she was incredibly wealthy, blah, 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 but it doesn't really say anything about a person who owned a large estate in Jamaica in the 18th century, what that actually meant, and where the money came from to pay for this portrait and why it sits there. So he was kind of trying to highlight these, you know, important connections, and that's this sort of reflection of how these alternative histories, hidden histories, are placed in the public domain are the things that I'm interested in. So that's just a flyer for the London Sugar and Slavery exhibition, which was opened at the museum in Docklands in 2007, and again was a sort of an attempt to think about, particularly from a London point of view, and the museum in Docklands, I don't know how many people have been there, but it's actually housed in a Georgian sugar warehouse. So the idea was, you know, this is where the slave sugar came from. It's based in West India Quay. I mean, it's an actual sort of embodiment of that history. So they particularly focused on that. And then in the corner is a Google mashup that is a way that I try and have my work, my research on black people in Victorian London is another way of sort of, I have a website and I put stuff on, and if you're in London you can click on it and see, you know, who these sort of black Londoners were. So it's just a way of sort of thinking about how these histories can work. But so I'm particularly interested in black history, particularly black women's lives in late Victorian London, and I just wanted to show you some images that's come from my research. So this is a group of young girls who were part of a children's home that was originally set up in the East End of London in the 1870s, although this photograph isn't documented, and part of the issues with thinking about this kind of social research, the problems of trying to research histories where there aren't people to speak to anymore, you know, no matter how complicated that history is. You can't do oral histories or whatever. How do you recover these histories? Now, of course, this isn't something particularly connected to black women. It's something, you know, consistent of money women's histories, and particularly of working class history more generally. So there are generalisations to be taken. But these are just snippets. So this is a young woman who also found herself in the children's home, who by coincidence was a 3rd generation black Londoner at least. In the 1880s, her grandfather was supposedly an escaped African slave that lived in the East End. So she has a long sort of heritage and history, which is, I would bet, entirely unknown, really. And then this is another young man. He was taken into the home. And rarely for a young working class man, there's a sort of several photographs that survive of him, although very little about what happened to him once he left the children's home. All that we do know is that he was an orphan, and although he entered the home with two of his sisters, they both died while he was probably 8 or 9 years old. So small moments of tragedy, as perhaps they might be, looking at young people at children's homes. But so what I'm interested in is why it is so unbelievably rare to see any histories like that in any kind of aspects of the British urban, particularly urban landscape, but you could also extrapolate that out to rural landscapes. So as well as being part of the advisory and curatorial team that worked on London Sugar and Slavery in the Museum in Docklands, I was also asked, perhaps interestingly, by the Education Department at the National Portrait Gallery to create some kind of intervention during 2007 there. When they came to me, they'd already decided that they weren't going to have a separate exhibition, and it had to be entirely based on their collection. So I mean, that's fine. And I've worked with the National Portrait Gallery on a number of times before. Now, in some ways, National Portrait Galleries are easier places to argue for social history because they are very much about people. The National Portrait Gallery collection is not so much concerned with the aesthetic quality of a painting. The collection is supposed to be about representing people who are important to British national identity and our understanding of Britishness and our heritage. So there was an immediate problem that the kind of people who have their paintings in the National Portrait Gallery are people who benefited from the slave trade. They are the kings and the queens and the royal family or whatever, who made money out of it. That's why they had the money to have their portraits painted, to be kept, to hang in a National Portrait Gallery. And they are still the people who are very much revered. So although initially I think there was a hope that there would be something about people who challenged and, brought about sort of the change in the law that meant this abolition of the slave trade came about, it was in fact very difficult to find those people in the collection. And similarly, the representation of black people in the collection is highly limited, and most of those people that do exist are in storage. So this, sorry, I should go quickly back. This image is a bust, a bronze of a doctor called Harold Moody. He was the one of the founders of the League of Coloured Peoples in the 1930s, and it's a bust done by his brother. They both came from Jamaica, and his brother studied art and became a sculptor, and it replaced another sculpture during the time of the trial. It replaced another sculpture by his brother, but after the trial, this went back into storage, and the old bust came out. So although there was a remembrance of a sort of black artist, most people don't know that Ronald Moody was a black man. There's no reason why you would do. And so that moment gets lost as well. But just quickly, this is a picture of Sarah Forbes Bonetta and her then, she'd just got married to James Pinson Ludlow Davis. Sarah Forbes Bonetta was a goddaughter of Queen Victoria, although she'd come through a rather harrowing biography to get here and to marry Ludlow Davis, who's a successful businessman in Lagos. But here, her sort of carte de visite cards, and incredibly unusual in a British context to see a black woman dressed in this way, to see a black couple holding themselves in this way, indeed to see them in any kind of context like this at all. This came out for the trail, but again, it's usually in store and remains in store. And although the trail was mostly historical, it started in the first room of the National Portrait Gallery, which is a Tudor hall, and ended at sort of the end of the Victorian Gallery, because one of the things I wanted to emphasise was that black history in Britain begins, as long as there's a British history, there's a black presence here, and it continues through after the slave trade, and is a continuous presence before what's usually believed to be the sort of coming of black people to Britain post the Second World War, particularly 1948 as a particularly symbolic date in a British context. But so then the argument is like, well, once these images go back into store, and we've seen that things can be different, is it possible to change things permanently? And if you do not have artefacts within your collections that allow you to speak to this history, what do you do about it? Well, you have to buy stuff. You either have to buy more space or you have to buy more stuff, and clearly this is an issue. This is something that, often beyond the realm of curators. It's about trustees, it's about the money that comes from government, how that gets prioritised in all sorts of ways. But there's also sort of aesthetic issues. So this is a picture of Victoria Davis, who was the eldest daughter of Sarah Forbes Bonetta. She too was a goddaughter of Queen Victoria, and this is a photograph of her on a visit to Britain when she was staying in Hampstead in North London, and she had her photograph taken. And this is a copy of a print that sits in the Royal Archives. But because traditionally photography allowed within the National Portrait Gallery, historical photography, really is expected to be original prints, it's difficult, for a sort of policy to be changed and just, to buy a copy of a print. Although, there is one here, and here is this interesting, important, beautiful woman, a beautiful family portrait, which could represent all sorts of things beyond ideas of blackness. But because of the aesthetic of what it is, it's still problematic to have it in there. There are some images that have recently been discovered. So this was an image that was found in store, I think on the back of another image, and it's a painting, an oil painting, it's actually quite small, of Mary Seacole, who some of you may have heard of. She was a Jamaican nurse who worked with British soldiers in the mid-Victorian period, and she was incredibly popular at the time. She wrote a biography of her experiences, and she's actually one of the few black people that really has any kind of status historically in a British context. But this painting had to be bought, and it was quite a struggle to raise I think it was just about £300,000, which compared to some of the debates about paintings being saved for the nation is really a really relatively small amount of money. And there were discussions about, well, why should it be, the government should pay for it, in the sense that, there are so few of these images, and there's quite an interesting discussion within the black community about, what this reflected about sort of representation and so on. So that was bought and that was saved. And on the right is another oil painting of Samuel Coleridge Taylor, who also in his day, at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, he was one of the most popular Victorian composers in Britain, very highly regarded by Elgar, an incredibly popular choral performer, but he's pretty much entirely forgotten now. But this oil painting of him as a child does exist within the National Portrait Gallery collection, but again, it just sits in storage. Now, admittedly, it's perhaps not the greatest painting, but as the National Portrait Gallery collection is not predicated on the fact that something has to be aesthetically great in order to be included, why is it not there? And it's, in essence, partly to do with arguments of space and a discussion that needs to be had. If we were sort of saying earlier today, permanent collections don't really change. It takes something of a great deal of upheaval to change them, and that's a debate that I would argue really needs to happen in Britain. But also in a broader European context, because these sort of arguments for a black presence in Britain can be replicated across all European countries, particularly those that had black colonies or legacies with the slave trade, but not necessarily those alone. This picture of the photograph of Miss Lala came to light just before an exhibition called Black Victorians went on show in Manchester and Birmingham a few years ago now, curated by an art historian called Jan Marsh. And it was looking at representations of black people in British art in the long 19th century, I should say. The image by Degas of Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando hangs in the National Gallery. Here, I think it is. But of course, there are many representations of it in different European museums. But as far as I know, and certainly not in the National Gallery, there's no reference to the fact that the woman in the painting is a black woman who was born when she was born in 1860, it was part of Germany, it's now part of Poland. What that speaks to are the kind of historical notions of the black presence in Europe, particularly in places that perhaps might not see themselves as having that kind of historical presence, is incredibly strong. But it needs the labels to change, which is very difficult to have them changed on a permanent basis. And it also needs, I would argue, these kinds of sort of histories to be replicated and thought about in different European countries. So how that might be done and how we might connect all these things together is something I'm particularly interested in. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sally, do you have PowerPoint?
Yeah, I've got mine.
You've got it set up, is it? Thanks very much. So our next speaker is Sally Hughes, who's both a senior lecturer in the Department of Publishing at Oxford Brookes and a PhD candidate in the Department of Museum Studies at Leicester. And the topic of her PhD dissertation is Museum Books, the Production and Reception of Print Media. But the title of the paper
Behind you.
is behind me. National Museums as Cultural Actors on the Globalised Political Stage.
Cool. Thank you. I'm interested in my presentation to just talk or look at globalisation as a process which involves blurring boundaries, and how museums provide spaces for that occurrence. So I'm talking about national museums as cultural actors on the globalised political stage. The Shah Abbas exhibition that we visited yesterday is the second exhibition in 4 years at the British Museum to explore the history and culture of Iran, a country with which the United Kingdom is in a protracted debate over values. When the Abbas exhibition opened earlier this year, it coincided with Babylon, Myth and Reality, which considered the legacy of this ancient Iraqi city and its impact on Western culture. These exhibitions, with their accompanying programs and publications relating to the culture and the countries of the Middle East, are evidence of the role that museums, particularly universal museums, play in the globalization of culture. Universal museums, or as the British Museum would describe itself, world museums, and now we've heard last night that they're global museums, are institutions which derive agency from their historical association with the state. In line with the suggestion that culture is contesting, amplifying, and altering the nature, direction, and understanding of the globalization process, the temporary exhibitions of these world museums facilitate the transcending of historic boundaries between culture, commerce, and politics, and as such form part of the museum's role in the globalization of culture. Museums as societal institutions present a double-edged relationship with culture. As reflective spaces, these institutions enable us to view evidence of cultural practices and to understand them. But simultaneously, museums are construction sites where agents question, temper, and transform cultures. As they act to present culture, world museums reach beyond and across national boundaries, seeking links with global companies, wealthy individuals, and nations to prepare, present, and fund temporary exhibitions. My longer paper drew evidence from 3 recent exhibitions at the British Museum to show both commercial and political involvement in these cultural events. But for this talk, I'll focus on the political resonances of the Shah Abbas exhibition. Iran's National Museum and an Iranian Cultural Heritage Organization, an agency of the Iranian government, contributed objects to the exhibition. But to secure the loans, Neil McGregor, the director of the British Museum, travelled to Iran. In return for the objects of the Shah Abbas exhibition, he promised a reciprocal loan to the National Museum of Iran of the Cyrus cylinder, a 2,500-year-old clay object inscribed with decrees from the Persian Emperor Cyrus the Great. He also agreed to a request by the Iranian Vice President's office to raise international awareness of the damage done to archaeological sites in Gaza during Israel's recent military operations. So there was a very definite political exchange there. Looking back at the Shah Abbas exhibition now, an early review of the exhibition in The Guardian acknowledged the political impact of the exhibition. What it said is, "This is a timely exhibition, a bold attempt to deepen understanding of a country with which our own is locked in a hostile diplomatic impasse. It is as if the museum is conducting its own independent foreign policy, using culture as a form of exchange between countries for which other methods of communication are difficult." The Shah Abbas exhibition is sponsored financially by the Iran Heritage Foundation. This is a page from its site where it lists itself as a UK-registered non-political charity dedicated to enhancing awareness of Iran's culture and history. But I do understand that this foundation was set up and is supported by people who left Iran with the Shah. The chairman of the foundation stresses the broader context of the exhibition and says that it goes beyond the aesthetic and provides insight into the political, social and religious themes which continue to run through and shape events and opinions in Iran, the broader Middle East and Central Asia. This is a quote by Neil MacGregor in the foreword to the catalogue, when he starts off in his foreword to make comparisons between the rulers Shah Abbas and Elizabeth I, which is intended to provide a starting point for the visitor's understanding of 17th century Iran. And his text concludes with a statement supporting the trope that an understanding of past cultures enlightens the present and the future. And this is what he says. The political resonances of the exhibition were even more apparent during the opening ceremony conducted by Jack Straw, who, as Foreign Secretary, led the UK's presence at the talks with Iran about their nuclear capabilities in 2007. And I should also add, he opened the previous Iranian exhibition that I mentioned in 2006. Jack Straw's remarks in the presence of the Iranian ambassador at the British Museum included unusually direct political points, which taken together appeared to some commentators to be an attempt to move forward the foreign policy debate between the UK and Iran. He acknowledged that the UK's relationship with Iran was hardly a balanced and reciprocal one. That's a quote. He said that the UK's government's support for the Shah gravely strained the relations between two countries and cited other examples of intervention. And finally, he urged other British and Western officials to gain a better understanding of Iran. The more we understand Iran, he said, the better it will be for the West's relations with the country and the better we understand ourselves and our shared history. The New York Times reported reaction to this opening speech in the actual private opening. You could almost physically feel the sense of amazement that such a discourse, never heard in a museum arena in England, caused among those who stood in the room, glass in hand. It felt like a dry run for an international conference aimed at bringing together long-estranged buddies. So at this private museum opening, a group of privileged individuals used the cultural event to engage in a global political process. The discourse presented at the event is strikingly different from that offered to the general museum visitor, where the political positioning is played down or even absent. Temporary exhibitions provide old museums with the opportunity to reinterpret collections in the light of contemporary challenges associated with economic and political realities of globalisation. But it is at the level of the World Museum status that a mandate is provided to these universal institutions to communicate and act as equals with nations. Globalisation is providing museums with a new arena in which to act. In his foreword to the British Museum annual review of last year, Neil Fitzgerald, who's the chairman of the trustees, acknowledges the role the museum has taken on itself in addressing contemporary political issues through history. As recent events have shown, cultural ties are a complex area. That is, however, no reason to shy away from difficult topics. Indeed, it is all the more reason to engage with them. The British Museum relishes its role as a forum for discussion. Globalisation, then, transcends the divides between economics, culture, and politics. Museums, as we know, are not neutral spaces. They may act to provide a forum for discussion, but their role in globalisation of culture is predicated on their ability to tap into a key feature of contemporary cultural trends, that of double coding, combining consumerism with politics and business in that nebulous space where aesthetics, agency, and patronage meet.
Thanks very much indeed. So that's all of our papers. Should we have the lights back on and get our speakers to come back up to the front? But I think that was 4 tremendously interesting papers and raising all kinds of interesting issues, getting to the heart of our kind of big question that we're faced with in this debate around this relationship with museums and globalisation. And I think particularly some of these notions, one of the R's, the reconfiguration one, sounds particularly pertinent in this context, and also the link with the previous session in a way where we were looking at difficult museums in a way, thinking of the difficult subject matter they deal with. But quite clearly the medium of the museum itself is also a difficult one. So it throws another kind of take on that idea of the difficulty of what we're talking about. So I think I'll carry this around, because otherwise we'll have another mediation of signalling to things. So should we open up the floor then? Yes.
Yes, I was very interested in the last lecture, and I would be interested in your opinion. I think to reach that kind of interaction between 2 nations, 2 states, that on the political level have a bit of a problematic relationship, it only works with museums that have a prestige that is bigger than maybe the government. That's the precondition. If we try to get loans, let's say from a Russian museum, Tretyakov Gallery, we would never get that. You need a very big prestige as a cultural institution that goes back centuries, and that has almost a status of a church. But, I mean, an institution that transgresses the political level. And I wanted to know how you see that, because it's very limited. That's the question, and let me pose the second already to Caroline. I was interested in your remark that the history you are researching, the role of the African or black population in Great Britain is not represented in the local museums, big or small, and you indicate that one would have to buy either more space or artifacts. But given the fact that there are none, I mean, space there is maybe, it's limited, but that's a question of money. But if you don't find proof, material proof of that history, what do you do? And but what does it tell us for future collection policies, how do we have to reorganize, or how do have these institutions to reorganize their collection efforts in order to include this knowledge for the present and for the future if they can't get material to show, let's say, 100 years back?
Should we take them in turns?
Thank you. Yes, I would agree with you, and I can think of other examples where, in particular, I mentioned the First Emperor exhibition, and it was very interesting to me. In fact, I really got the first idea of this for myself when I read the foreword that was written. Because there's a sentence in there, and I think I put it in my paper, where the word British Museum and China are given equal status, and so the British Museum is absolutely at that level of the nation, and is able to communicate it at that level. It seems to me that culture does provide this space which is somewhat nebulous, so it can be interpreted and used in so many different ways, whereas that political arena, players are coming from quite fixed positions, whereas, there is that potential for culture that it just blurs things just nicely, so you can move forward without perhaps having too many fixed positions.
Am I allowed to intervene? Because, in some respects, that's a naive reading of it, isn't it? Because, it's
perhaps deliberately naive.
Well, sure. Insofar as because of that, it allows, actually, you quoted that Guardian thing, the independent foreign policy, but, how independent? And therefore, actually, that nebulous nature actually could perhaps play into the, political process.
Do you want to come back on that?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment in relation to that. The National Museum of the American Indian very strongly uses its presence on the mall there as a political voice, and to a certain extent developed, Kylie Massage writes about this, developed the museum in order to negotiate politically across the globe on a kind of a neutral ground, but also symbolically and strategically representing First Nations voices.
Thank you. So that's given me some time to think about your question. And I think there are three main issues. I've put it in this book. One is the need for reinterpretation of things that are already on display. So one example I can think of, the National Portrait Gallery, there are lots of others. So a bit like the sort of case of Miss Lala. There's an image of Abdul Karim. He was Queen Victoria's, he taught her Hindi, basically Hindustani as she called it. And there's a photograph of her at her writing desk outside, and Abdul Karim standing on the side of the carpet. And the label says Queen Victoria at her writing desk. Now he's not, he is even we know what his name was, and he's not even included, and so to get his name included took a great deal of effort. But there is someone, it's just really blatant racism in a kind of British, and I would argue European sense, where there are people who are not white in images, but it's like they're just not there. So there's that kind of that need to reinterpret what is already there, and that history is difficult because quite often those people, particularly in a European context, are unnamed and unknown servants or enslaved people. So, but you can at least acknowledge that there's another person in the picture, which gets people thinking, hopefully. So that's one thing I think to reinterpret. Then is to go into your storerooms and see, what is there. No one's done that in many spaces. To systematically go through and find out what is there, and there might be some really interesting stuff there. Like you turn a painting over, and it's a picture of Mary Seacole. That's, that might be the only one that's there. But even if it happened in every national, then that would turn up some quite interesting things. And then the other issue is that there needs to be an acceptance that the knowledge to transform those spaces is not held in-house. So if you want to think about, and I'm just talking, I don't only do stuff on people of African descent, but it can be applied to, within a British context, to Irish history, the National Portrait Gallery, probably to women's history, to sort of working class history, to all these histories that have not usually had anyone from an academic sort of perspective focusing on within museums. To include those stories, you need to go out to people and ask them to come in and work on your collections or whatever they might be, and see what they say and what they can find. And I think then on top of that, it might also be a case of saying, okay, well, we need some more photographs, we can't have original ones, maybe there's a case to be made for changing our collection policy in order to be more representative. I mean, it's slightly easier, again, as I say, with the National Portrait Gallery, because they do have the social history that drives them rather than a kind of sort of aesthetic. But the need is to be open, because in 50 years' time, that will be different audiences making similar claims and asking similar questions. And so I think museums need to find a way to be much more flexible, so these arguments just aren't made again and again and again.
Yes, just to follow on with that, just I have another question. One is maybe I was thinking, interesting the presence of representation you mentioned. I was wondering maybe and you referred to your own work in that respect, and whether that's just an ongoing process, because perhaps if you look at it strictly speaking in Britain, you'd say maybe it has come first through the contemporary arts, so maybe the black art movement and in like the visual arts, visual contemporary arts have had that struggle, and through progressively in the 80s and managed to have like a set of exhibitions through the Independence Gallery, and maybe I mentioned the Trophies of Empire exhibition in 1992, which was like a bit like the Dogs thing, was like Hull, Bristol and Liverpool, temporary sort of exhibitions, and maybe the progressive sort of change to actual collections is a process that will be attained through that more sort of global movement, which was not on its own as well. It was, I suppose, it was related to representation of minorities more generally speaking. So maybe you don't know what you think about that. And otherwise, I just wanted to say a word again, which relates to periodization, I suppose, because you both mentioned the question of the museum as like a social place for social inclusion, and that made me think of debates related currently to the artist as a social worker, and that can be related quite decisively to a general, in the UK and perhaps the US, or to a sort of ideological framework or the general social-political context. And so I was making this parallel. I wondered what you thought about that, and it would also, I suppose, you could also link it to something that's been mentioned often, which is the sense of place thing. This also could be related to the socio-political context, or if you prefer, the sort of cultural policies, and that as being influenced by by ideas promoted within a general political shift. So I wondered what you thought about that.
So is that mainly directed to Shash? Sharon, did you want to come back? It's more of a comment first. It's like directed, isn't it?
You're doing a great job. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, I immediately just wanted to ask you, I mean, this idea of the artist as social worker, what's the periodization of that?
Well, I would argue that it's...
Sorry, harmful. Sorry.
Well, I suppose it's. I would say it's been really blatant in the 90s, but I would personally argue that it comes from the sort of general paradigmatic shift I would call it, from, well, not I personally, but from the arrival manufacturer. So the set of policies that were obviously installed in all kinds of aspects of society, the arts being one, affected that. And although they were not, I mean, this were not particularly pro-art, but the ideas of like entrepreneurship or value for money, that would be more relevant, I suppose, was then taken upon by New Labour. And I mean, there's lots of jobs for artists to work in a residency, but doing like a social program with the communities, but not at all in the sort of early sort of Marxist or the socialist or red town halls, early 80s way, but more in a sort of inclusive manner.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, you can. One thing I kind of struggle with thinking about this kind of the social work dimension of the museum is, of course, there's a very long history. So whole museums like the Green Museum, the Deutsche Hygiene Museum, and so on. There were particular kind of, in some cases, fairly literal social work kind of dimensions to them. So there are some things that have been going on, but I think there's been an interesting. I think it works a bit differently now because there's such a strong kind of sense of and something coming back from the communities. It's seen as a more dialogical kind of process, I think, and that's also this relinquishing of control from the museum. So it's not done in such a paternalistic way, basically, as before. And I think your suggestion. I mean, I think the role of our art and artists. There's really a whole set of really interesting things there. But yeah, how the whole set of ideas, which in Britain we see under Thatcherism, this sort of emphasis on the use value of art and of culture and so on. How I think a lot of those sort of social inclusion directives did come out of that, but then I don't know, my sense is they've got sort of then taken over by people to really use in other ways, so that then there is this other phase. I mean, I think this is just all really interesting. So there's things that look like they've been going along a long time, but then within that there are things that I think actually are quite important shifts, and I think that's really, really helpful for you to identify some of those. And yeah, like when you talk on what I know you're going to talk on later, that would be a good chance for us to try and take that further, definitely. Yeah.
Helena.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess, Sharon, I wanted to get you to talk about the multiversity example that you left us with as a way of, I guess, going back to the bigger reflections on whose responsibility institutional change is and how that has worked its way out in different ways. And I think the 2007 Bicentenary is a really good example of how responsibility was distributed or not distributed, and the role of the artist played a big role in that, interestingly, I think, in terms of museums deferring responsibility for difficult issues onto artists who were then somehow supposed to, black artists who were then supposed to solve them in some way, often with communities the museum wasn't necessarily having a sustained relationship with anyway. But yeah, I think maybe one of the interesting shifts in those, so there are continuities in terms of co-production of knowledge in the museum sector, that's certainly true. One of the interesting shifts is the way that's been adopted by policy recently, and it's been increasingly referred to as something that all museums should be aiming for. And so the multiversity example really intrigued me, because it seemed like on one hand it was trying to preserve, by not allowing people to talk to each other, preserving a kind of authenticity that in a sense was that, well, two things. One, maybe didn't exist anyway and had to be artificially manufactured by the museum, and also that the form of exhibitions and the kind of the hierarchy of certain kind of forms of display were going to, well, had an agency in that process anyway. So I guess really I just was wondering whether you and maybe anyone else in the panel wanted to reflect on the ways in which the forms of exhibitions themselves have agency in terms of this kind of community engagement, co-production work, and yeah, really how that fits into whose responsibility social and institutional changes. Thanks.
you want to start, Sharon? For the first bit, and then...
No, someone else.
I keep talking about the National Museum of the American Indian, but initially I believe that was the approach that they used, was to solicit whatever they wanted from the different nations that were going to be represented there, and that became problematic.
But content, not form. Yeah?
Content and form.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that in the talk that I heard initially about that. Now I'm not sure how it ended up, but one of the critiques on the National Museum of the American Indian was the unprofessional nature of the exhibits that were offered. So I think that is the part that interests me. That what you have here is non-expert people using exhibition space to do things, to do museum making in whatever non-professional way they want to, but they're expressing their, I mean, it's the process there that's interesting, how they come together as a community, how they fight it out and do what they want in that space. It's almost more important, I've said this before, than the final product that happens in that space. So I'd be really, I am interested in seeing what they're going to end up with there in terms of the professional nature of the exhibit form itself.
I mean, there's also the mediation of the designers, the curatorial kind of teams and so on, isn't there? So it's interesting to see how that, the idea then gets translated and changed and actually, not so different after all.
That's an interesting point that you've made, and it just made me think about the point. Always come back to the British Museum. It's so easy to throw brickbats at it, but it has agency and it has power. I think probably because it maintains control. I can't think of an exhibition at the British Museum where they have invited in and let go and allowed that kind of community or other voices to occur. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it sort of acts, at that level of statehood, probably because of the control it has. And I just wonder, you're talking about the National Museum of the American Indian, it's on the Mall, and yet it was being criticised for the professionalism of the exhibitions, where it invited, whatever, how you present it, other agents to come in and use that space for their voice. It's almost like it's one or the other. You can't have both. Perhaps, I don't know, whether anyone else have a comment about that.
Sorry to come back to sort of a British example again, but 2007 was interesting in this case because perhaps for reasons of not wanting to take responsibility. So also I wonder if, subjects that are difficult, like a new national museum of American Indian history or whatever, these are things that do we not really want to take responsibility for that, so we'll let people get on with it and do the best they can, and we just won't really worry about it in some way. So there's a cynical part of me that thinks that perhaps that plays an issue. And I think in 2007 that was partly cynically done, and it was done through, okay, we don't hold the knowledge within the museums to do this kind of work, and we need to invite people in to tell us what they want. It's also because that came around through various people lobbying to have something happen. Because why 2007 had to be the anniversary of the bicentenary of the slave trade is not a coincidence. It could have been the tricentenary of the unification of England and Scotland. Well, that wasn't very politically apt at the time. It could have been the 150th anniversary of the first Indian uprising. It could have been the 60th anniversary of the Indian independence. There's a particular reason. There were particular things that could be celebrated about Britishness that were particularly pertinent at that moment. Now that didn't happen at museums. That happened at the government level. But those things filtered down through the decision for funding and stuff to go through. But at a workshop that reflected back on community consultation or involvement, all these people gave all this time for which they were not paid for in any way. They were not. So why should they do a professional job if they're not treated like professional people. You know, there's that, you need to give people the resources to do those kinds of things, be it time or money or support or whatever it is, in order to people to contribute those things if those are the standards they expect. And it's a bit different in those cases, but often the people that things people contributed to don't even exist anymore. So people are like, well, why should I do it again? I mean, it's kind of, I contributed all this time and stuff. So I think this idea that things are co-created, I don't think that's strictly true. And I think, museum, there's a need to be a bit more honest about the kind of, that knowledge transfer still is rather one way, kind of, in some situations.
If you've got sorry. Oh, did you have a?
Yeah,
sorry. Yes, you.
I wasn't totally abnegating my responsibility to answer that question. I mean, what I should just say directly on the multiversity. I mean, all I know is from hearing Tony Shelton talk about it, and I do think he's brilliant and has fantastic ideas, and he's one of these people who really takes theory and tries to do something different, and I'm really excited to see what will come out. I'm also very intrigued as to know whether the story of the making of it will be told and in what way, because clearly it's and I should say, I think in this example, I don't think there's this abnegation of responsibility that I think we do see in some cases, which is like, let them do it themselves sort of thing, then we don't have to worry, well, get an artist in, it's awkward, and I think we see a lot of that going on. But I don't think that's what's involved here. I think it is actually trying to take on board certain kind of theoretical ideas and actually go with them and see what happens. But it's clearly entailed a strange actually reinsertion of museum control. So that's one of the paradoxes, and then this other paradox of a strange kind of essentialisation that goes on in trying to deal with diversity, which is really just what I wanted to highlight with that. The other thing that you raised there, though, was, which I think that second point goes directly into, is about the forms themselves, and how they can play into or set up certain constraints. And Paul mentioned, that whole process of the designers and so on, and how that works. And I suppose one of my bees in my bonnet is I think we still don't really know enough, and we don't have enough research on many of those things, on how do people actually really kind of, all the other stuff that goes on with particular kinds of formats and particular kinds of layouts. I mean, I think there is some nice work, but there's masses more that I think we could do with knowing about that too.
Yes, I'm interested in a very minor issue, and I hesitated whether I should pose the question at all, because it's sort of going back to a very small issue, but since I you talked about that Degas painting, and you said it should be relabeled, and the story of the artist, artist should be told. What I'm interested, would you indicate that if we know who is the person who's portraited on the painting, should the label tell that story, or would you say because it would be important to integrate the history of British Africans, that should be a special point to do it in this case? Is that, my question is, should there be a general reconsideration of labeling in art, giving not only the information who was the artist, when was it done, what kind of material, but who is the object of the portrait and what's his story, to give a context on the painting? Or would you be interested to do it in order to point out a certain vanished history that has to come out? That is a little question.
Yes, it's a good question. And I'll answer it quickly, sorry, by just going back to the question about the sort of the struggle of contemporary black artists. And I think that's true, that struggle has taken place. You know, arguments can be made about their representation in Tate Britain or Tate Modern or, you know, the equivalents. But I think in European society, where history is so important to our national identity, that we need to deal with these things historically as well. So you go to the National Portrait Gallery, and the contemporary galleries are much more diverse. They, you know, they really are probably reflections of the nation, class, gender, sexuality, whatever, in a way that the historical galleries are not at all. So that's also because they can collect things differently. Now again, the National Portrait Gallery is slightly different because, of course, it's about the person who sits in the picture. So it's important for those people to be spoken of, I think. Paintings such as Miss Lala is slightly different because they are supposed to be there for their aesthetic quality or their contribution to European understandings of themselves or something. Because, you know, sketches of Degas are perfectly acceptable, even though they're not finished or whatever they might be, because the man's important. So I don't know that social history does play a role in those galleries in a way that is not necessarily obviously revealed all the time. But the way the trail at the MPG worked was that the standard labels remained the same, and I wrote different labels that spoke to those images in a different way. So they added stuff, or they slightly contradicted things. So Charles Dickens was involved. It's like, Charles Dickens, you know, one of the greatest British writers of our time, blah, 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 blah. And it was a kind of, did you also, I mean, it wasn't this, but it was like, did you know he was racist? It's basically, he was involved in a particular campaign to support a governor in Jamaica who had set down a rebellion in an incredibly bloody way. And Charles Darwin, who is often seen as a kind of social Darwinism associated with racism in the sort of public mind, was very publicly on the alternative side that argued that this governor should be impeached and raise money for that side of the committee. So those labels tried to highlight those kind of contradictions. Now, to go through and repackage all labels all of the time, personally I'm interested in who sits on the side of a riverbank in Impressionist painting. I would like to know that if we knew that, but not everyone might do. And curators were like, you can't have more than 35 words and people won't read it and stuff. But if you were committed, you could always write new labels that could always be changed. So for 6 months they could highlight the black presence, or for 6 months they could highlight issues of sexuality, or for 6 months they could highlight issues of disability, or whatever. Would be a way of refreshing it and keeping it moving and making people always know, well, if I come back in 6 months, then I'll learn something else about this page. Because it's true, you can't say everything you'd want to say about it. And we might look at the image of Miss Lala in 50 years and there'll be totally different stories that want to be told about it that aren't on the label, that might say, well, she was a mixed race woman, isn't that interesting? So I think it is about trying to have that transformation, and I wouldn't want to claim a special place.
I would hire you immediately.
I mean, one could let the labels grow, leave multiple labels. But of course, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, also in the virtual and real thing, because of course the internet, there's multiple ways of leaving comments and letting them stay there. So maybe there is that kind of version. Did you want to?
Well, I just was going to add one thing. The label about Mrs. Oswald, it made me think actually about the Shah Abbas exhibit and the kind of comments we were making about it. The labels that were presented there I wasn't interested in the stuff that they were saying. They were saying, you know, things about the Shah when I really wanted to know about, I don't know, whatever, maybe the hidden histories, who's behind it, what about the craftsman that did it, or what about the objects itself? There was very little information about the objects. So the whole problem of writing labels, that's a great idea. Let's do wiki labels, you know, and how can we do that? Well, and then the other answer to labels, to me anyway, is this face-to-face thing. Let's have more people to talk to, so that if there's somebody on duty there that knows about this exhibition, then I can talk to them and ask them all those questions.
That won't cost much.
I don't care.
I wanted to pick up one mind small thing and one perhaps larger thing. I wanted to come back to the multiversity, because I wondered who, when you said they will talk to this particular First Nation. So I'm probably get the discourse from First Nation people, and there are a number of those peoples, and they will talk to them to decide how they're going to structure those sections. Who among those peoples will they talk to? I mean, will we get to the same thing that whoever is the black presence or the disabled presence or the female presence among those people won't get to answer, and whoever is the person who does will inevitably be somewhat unrepresentative. I mean, I was also quite curious with the Shah Bus exhibition that there was a very interesting section on the Armenian Christians. And I'm afraid I wondered where the Jews were, because presumably they were always probably quite an important presence, and questions of religious tolerance in relation to Jews might have been very interesting too. And it just seemed to me that was a sort of visible absence of the kind that might have been expected.
A health warning has to go on to this this recording. I do not speak for the multiversity. I mean, I just heard someone want to talk about it, so I really don't know all that much. But more generally, I mean, I think those are very important questions, and I mean, I suppose I do observe some of that with Manchester Museum's work that it does with different groups, and who becomes part of the museum, what's the name of it, not the museum advisory group, something like that, and it often is very self-appointed, people with very particular sorts of views, and it's quite hard to get beyond that. I had a nice discussion with Helen yesterday about, whether actually anthropologists should do more to sort of, if you like, help there, so you have more ethnographic work going on that really, then you can know a bit more about, well, who does get to become the spokespeople of who isn't, and how, and so on. But on the multiversity, I don't know exactly.
It was actually something that Susan raised as well, about when there's restitution, who actually decides what is
absolutely, yeah. And often it's, I mean, if you look through the kind of literature there are a few really nice accounts of, certain people getting to prevent certain exhibitions from communities when other people in those communities had wanted them to happen, and that sort of thing. Not that much, really. I mean, I do feel like actually documenting what happens, these kind of processes, we should have more of it. The more that, I mean, you talk to people working in museums as well, and they often have amazing stories to tell, but they wouldn't, it's too awkward, and you can't write them down as well, of course.
Helen's got a question, but Matt, did you want to ask something?
Just a quick comment on that. It's just it's very important stuff, but also I think we should remember that there's probably quite a lot of people that are really not interested in taking on these roles, that don't really give a damn. I mean, now we assume that there's a big fight among the Indians about who gets to represent, but I mean, in anthropology, it's full of key informants who have these their own agendas and sort of putting themselves forth as being allowed to speak. Suddenly, and maybe someone who had been sidelined in the, so there's all these people who also don't really care about it.
Does anyone want to reply? Go.
Also, to come back, that there's also a danger of the sort of the essentialising of who is experts within communities. So just because the black, people who were enslaved in the transatlantic slave trade have black skin, the assumption was people in the black community have the knowledge to help people do that. I mean, the majority of people who do black historical research in this country are white. But, there's all sorts of kind of politics about who gets engaged and why they got engaged and stuff. And so then there's a danger that the opportunities to make connections across people get lost, because there's an assumption that this particular cultural group, because they have black in the title, will be able to answer our questions. Well, they're a community, and you can consult them on certain things like how will they feel to see depictions of naked women being whipped, but they're not going to be able to tell you where those whips came from necessarily, all sorts of things, in a sense that there are two different processes of consultation that need to take place, and I think often they get conflated, which is kind of the other side of what you're saying.
Well, I did work with one group in Canada that was doing exhibition on the Underground Railroad. And it brought together a consultative committee, and there was all sorts of people who were on the committee because they were black. But the debate behind the scenes was fabulous. There was people who had been there whose family had been there since the 1700s. There was new, Jamaican immigrants. Here were these people that were all different, trying to figure out some sort of singular story. One black public face that they had to put forward. It was an immensely difficult conversation that went on behind the scenes in trying to come up with an exhibit with a story.
If Helen's got a question, but is there anyone else, because we're running a bit out of time, so Helen and then you, and then is there anyone I haven't missed anyone?
So I just wanted to very quickly ask the panel, and maybe all of us really, about the I think really interesting tension between experimental interpretation techniques in exhibitions, which have often been responding to critiques of traditional forms of representation, maybe the single lion hang in an art gallery, or certain forms of labelling, and so that it's kind of responding to that critique. So for example, Paul, you write about this in the exhibition experiments book about kind of maybe Emily Cabalda's as well, that kind of feeling of discombobulation or uncertainty or unsettlingness. And I think this is a kind of something that's come up again and again and again. So this idea that because there was a sense of creating a safety in interpretation in traditional form, therefore we need to have a sense of unsafety in a kind of more innovative, more radical form of exhibition interpretation. But as Paul, you mentioned in your article, and I think Bennett does in the 2006 article in Museum Frictions that people have been referring to as well, there is a potential tension there between the way in which that's the debate around accessibility to new audiences is being configured. So I really just want to ask about that and how you think that debate's being developed and your take on it, really.
Can we possibly take these two together? So hang on to that question as well.
Yeah, just a very quick appreciation of this reinterpretation, the need to reinterpret the sources, the historical sources that we have. Just by way of analogy, I recently read a very interesting article about international law, and it was reanalyzing ancient cases according to new interpretative means, and particularly it was analyzing a very ancient case about the seizure of vessels, so it was about maritime law, and this historian was analyzing this case according to the notion of jus cogens, and because it was about slavery. So a vessel was blocked, and it was seized by a Caribbean country, I can't remember the name of this country, and basically Peru was claiming that this seizure was illegitimate, it was unlawful according to international law. But then there was the arbitrator, the King of Japan, who said, look, you can't really claim that this is against international law, because it's true that this Caribbean country blocked and seized your ship, but you were trading slaves, and this is illegal under international law. And so basically the same case, which had been analyzed according to maritime concepts, seizure of vessels, nowadays has been reinterpreted according to the notion that slavery is a crime against humankind as a whole. And so this is fascinating, and thank you for reminding me this sort of the need to reinterpret sources.
Thanks. So that was more of a comment.
Yeah,
so the question really was about.
Yeah.
As it's sometimes chosen the kind of an elitist idea that you've got this idea that to play with the form, to unsettle audiences, also alienates other audiences.
Well, the very political critique of exhibitions has led to a kind of aesthetic which might be counterproductive in terms of generating.
Who's going to tackle it first? It was to the panel.
Or maybe it's just something.
Yes.
It's
a dilemma.
I was wondering whether this comment might bring one or two things together, and it sort of comes out to some extent from some of the research I've been doing about catalogues and exhibitions. It seems to me that when an audience member or visitor approaches, and this is nothing new here, but when they approach an exhibition, they approach it as a finished piece, and they come to it with their own ideas and their own packages. But what very rarely happens is that any context is provided to them right in the exhibition itself. If you want the context, you have to buy the catalogue. Yeah. So there's no guidance to the visitor to begin with as to what is it? What are these overall guiding ideas? Is this an experimental exhibition? Is this the single line hang? You know, how is it being presented? We almost expect, well, we do expect visitors to work it out for themselves. And I'm not sure that's always fair if we really want to get our ideas across.
Yeah, I mean, and just adding to that, I mean, I do think it's the dilemma, and the other issue there, though, that comes in, I think, is what kind of venue and all the other cues that are being given. So just right back to this same point, and what you can maybe do in a sort of avant-garde gallery with its white walls might be very different, or people come in terms of what they're expecting from, say, in a science museum and things. And I think, you know, in what you do, for museum stuff, they really need to work with that, which doesn't mean you can't unsettle and do something experimental in those other places, but you really do have to kind of do it in awareness of what, how people might be interpreting it.
I mean, part of the very idea is to unsettle, then to kind of settle someone in the kind of unsettling experience is kind of against the idea. No, but to prepare. I mean, maybe.
But so you can do it right.
Yes.
Not just necessarily properly.
It also comes back to something Carol mentioned about the intervention. And I was just wondering about the idea of the museum institution inviting the intervention in a way is a contradiction in terms, in that sense. It's like, come and, because in a way it's about trying to relinquish control, and yet when you're inviting it, you're orchestrating something which is controlling. So it's a kind of a similar kind of Andrew, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to. I think it's also one of the problems with the museums is trying to address really different audiences in the same space, and there aren't many people that are expected to do that. There aren't many people that are expected to give lectures to people who have done a PhD in a subject and people who are 5. Actually, to try and reach that breadth of audience is really difficult. And doing research for the London Sugar and Slavery Gallery, two of the things that we went to see the Holocaust Memorial Exhibition at the Imperial War Museum, which is recommended for 14-year-olds and over. I think one of the Jewish memorials in Berlin is also recommended for 14-year-olds and over. There's a human rights display at the Imperial War Museum suggested for 16-year-olds and over. Now, we didn't have that option. We needed to create a space that was going to speak to young people and old people, but it is a reminder that there are, telling certain narratives in certain ways does allow you to do things if you can focus it. And actually, museum spaces are expected to cover this really broad brush of people in all sorts of ways. And I think that is part of the problem why it's up, because the old museums weren't safe for lots of people. They were horrible, intimidating spaces, where you would come in and see some really important cultural artifact sitting on the floor and just go, what's happened? And I think so that kind of the reverse of people who might have used to have been safe are now unsettled is, it's going to be very difficult to please all those audiences.
Great. Okay, I think we're out of time now, so just please join with me in thanking the panel for some